There are stories older than language, older than the pyramids, older even than firelight whispered into myth. They speak of a time when the world drowned. From the mountains of Armenia to the valleys of the Indus, from the shores of the Pacific to the forests of the Amazon, humanity remembers one shared catastrophe, a flood so vast it erased the old world and gave birth to the one we live in now. The story appears everywhere. In the tablets of Sumer, a man named Ziusudra survives a divine deluge. In the Hebrew scriptures, Noah builds an ark and rides the waters of creation's undoing. In India, the sage Manu follows a speaking fish to salvation. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha rebuild humankind from stones cast over their shoulders. The Hopi tell of the fourth world drowned by fire and flood. The Chinese remember Yu, who tamed the waters that covered the land. None of these peoples ever met, yet their memories converge like rivers meeting the same sea. For centuries, scholars and theologians argued over whether these stories described a single event or a symbolic truth. Were they parables of moral renewal, or were they echoes of something real, a cataclysm that reshaped both planet and mind? In the last century, science began to ask the same question with new tools: geology, climatology, and archaeology. The rocks and the ice began to speak the language of myth. They told of an Earth at the edge of transformation. 12,000 years ago, the last ice age was dying. Gigantic ice sheets, kilometers thick, covered half the northern hemisphere. When they melted, sea levels rose more than 100 meters, drowning vast coastal plains where humans had lived for tens of thousands of years. Evidence of sudden floods lies in scoured valleys, in sediment layers, and in the mysterious scars left by lakes that burst their icy prisons in single violent moments. Yet water alone may not tell the full story. Some scientists now believe that the end of the Ice Age was accelerated by a celestial visitor, a comet or a swarm of them that shattered in the skies and set the world ablaze before plunging it into a 1,000-year winter. When the cold finally broke, the ice collapsed in torrents, carving new rivers, raising new seas, and erasing entire landscapes. Out of that destruction came rebirth. The survivors of the flood built temples, planted fields, and invented time. From their fear and memory arose the first civilizations: Sumer, Egypt, the Indus, the Yellow River. Every dawn of human culture stands upon the ruins of a drowned world. This book is an investigation into that memory, part science, part myth, and wholly human. It follows the trail from story to stone, from scripture to sediment, from the gods of water to the data of ice cores. It asks whether the Great Flood was not just a tale of punishment, but a geological and cosmic event that ended one age and began another. To find the answer, we must listen to the oldest storytellers, the rocks, the glaciers, and the oceans themselves. They remember what humanity has forgotten, that the flood was real, that it came swiftly, and that it changed everything. The waters rose once before, and someday they will rise again. In the beginning, there was water and memory. Every ancient civilization that looked up to the heavens or down into the river mud told a story of a world that drowned and was reborn. The Hebrews told of Noah, a man warned by the divine to build an ark large enough to hold all living things. The Mesopotamians told of Utnapishtim, who built a vast ship sealed with bitumen before the gods unleashed a storm so terrible it scoured the earth clean. The Greeks spoke of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who cast stones over their shoulders to repopulate the world after the deluge. In India, Manu was saved by a fish who pulled his vessel through the rising waters. In China, the legend of Gun and Yu told of floods that covered mountains, only tamed by divine engineering. Across the world, from the Haida of the Pacific Northwest to the Hopi of the desert plateaus, from the Yoruba in Africa to the Aboriginal Australians, there is the same refrain. The water rose, the world ended, and only a few survived to begin again. It is easy to think these are coincidences, echoes of imagination repeating the same metaphor for renewal. Yet the pattern is too perfect, the rhythm too universal. Entirely separate peoples, separated by oceans and by time, all remembering an age when water erased the boundaries of their known world. Could all of humanity have inherited a single traumatic memory, passed from tongue to tongue through song and ritual, until myth became religion and religion became history? If these stories are not merely moral allegories, then perhaps they point to an event buried deeper than writing, deeper than civilization itself. An event so immense that it left not just geological scars, but psychic ones. The question that rises like a tide between these tales is simple and terrifying. Did the Great Flood actually happen? Not a metaphorical flood, not a poetic flood, but a real catastrophe that overwhelmed continents and redefined human destiny. The answer, if it exists, lies not in scripture or song, but in the sediments of the earth and the isotopes of the ice. The end of the last ice age, around 10,800 to 9,600 years before the Common Era, marks a time of extraordinary and violent transformation. The Pleistocene epoch was ending. Vast sheets of ice that had blanketed North America and Eurasia for tens of thousands of years were melting. Mammoths, mastodons, and saber-toothed cats still roamed a landscape of tundra and grasslands, but their world was collapsing. Human beings were there too, small bands of hunter-gatherers clinging to the edges of glaciers, fishing in rivers that no longer exist, walking coastal plains that today lie hundreds of meters beneath the ocean. They did not yet write, but they spoke, and they remembered. When the ice cracked and the seas began to rise, they told stories to their children, who told them to theirs. Perhaps those stories, carried forward through unbroken chains of speech, are what became the flood myths we know today. In the cold light of geology, water is not symbolic. It is weight, force, pressure, and erosion. It leaves fingerprints that last for millennia. When geologists dig into ancient river valleys, they sometimes find layers of sand and clay that should not be there, traces of catastrophic flooding far greater than any seasonal rise. In the depths of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, cores of seabed sediment reveal sudden pulses of freshwater and silt, coinciding almost exactly with the time our ancestors said the world drowned. The idea of a real flood, however, was long dismissed as superstition. For centuries, scientists considered the notion of a global deluge to be impossible. Yet the 20th and 21st centuries have shown that Earth's history is a chain of disasters: asteroid impacts, volcanic winters, sudden ice melts, and mass extinctions. The planet changes not gently, but violently in geological heartbeats. A flood that reshaped the coasts and drowned entire regions no longer seems impossible. Around 12,000 years ago, the planet's climate lurched. After a long period of gradual warming, it suddenly plunged back into near glacial conditions. This event, now known as the Younger Dryas, remains one of the great mysteries of paleoclimatology. For over 1,000 years, temperatures fell dramatically. Then, just as suddenly, they shot upward again. The ice sheets melted at a rate unprecedented in the geological record. In that thaw, the waters rose more than 120 meters, and ancient shorelines vanished beneath the waves. Imagine what that meant for people alive at the time. Whole continents changed shape within generations. Islands disappeared. Inland seas expanded. Coastal hunting grounds were swallowed by salt water. If your world was bounded by rivers and the horizon, it must have seemed as though the gods themselves had turned against creation. For a people without maps or mathematics, such a transformation could only be understood as divine punishment or cosmic renewal. The archaeologist's spade and the oceanographer's sonar now trace the outlines of those drowned worlds. Off the coast of Britain lies Doggerland, a vast plain that once connected Europe to the island now called England. Beneath the South China Sea, the submerged continent of Sundaland once held jungles and river valleys larger than modern Indonesia. In the north, the bridge between Siberia and Alaska, called Beringia, vanished beneath the sea, severing the connection between Asia and the Americas. Every one of these vanished lands was inhabited by humans. Everyone was lost to rising water. These were not slow drownings. Geological and climate data suggest that the final pulses of sea level rise came in bursts, events lasting mere centuries or even decades, not millennia. A person could be born in a coastal camp and live to see the shoreline move kilometers inland. Villages would have been washed away, rivers rerouted. What would remain except memory and the instinct to tell of it? The myths then are not inventions but warnings. They tell us how fragile our equilibrium is. When we strip them of divine trappings, what remains is human observation. The water came, it covered the land, and afterward nothing was the same. The people who survived rebuilt on higher ground, perhaps swearing never to forget. Their descendants turned the memory into sacred narrative, embedding within religion the story of Earth's last great upheaval. The deeper one looks into these stories, the more consistent the details become. In nearly all versions there is a moral dimension. The flood comes to cleanse corruption or hubris, but underneath that moral fabric is a shared experience of environmental collapse. In some, the survivor sends out birds to find dry land, a detail repeated from Mesopotamia to the Bible to indigenous Pacific tales. In others, a mountaintop or high plateau becomes the refuge of humanity, a motif that mirrors the geological reality that uplands remained habitable while the lowlands vanished. It is tempting to see myth as invention, but in a pre-literate world, it was archive and memory. Every generation repeated its inherited truths, compressing centuries of environmental observation into story. The flood, in this sense, is the first scientific record humanity ever kept, an oral record of climate change, encoded in narrative so it could never be forgotten. When we step back and look at the data, the pattern is unmistakable. Around 12,000 years ago, at the very end of the Pleistocene, the Earth's systems convulsed. Something happened that shattered the stability of the melting world. To understand the flood, we must first understand the trigger. What force could have stopped the planet's warming and plunged it back into ice? What could have stored up so much potential energy in the frozen north that when the thaw finally resumed, the release drowned continents? To answer that, we must look beyond myth and even beyond human history. We must look to the sky, the ice and the rocks themselves, where the record of that ancient catastrophe still lies waiting. The memory of water is written not just in stories, but in the planet itself, and it is from those silent witnesses, the glaciers, the sediments, the isotopes, that we will begin to unearth the truth of what really happened at the end of the last ice age, when the waters rose and the world we know today was born. The world before the flood was a world of extremes, balanced on the edge of transformation. The last ice age had lasted for tens of thousands of years. Vast white walls of ice stretched across the northern continents, covering much of what is now Canada, Scandinavia, and northern Europe. The Laurentide and Fennoscandian ice sheets were kilometers thick, their weight pressing down the crust of the Earth. So much water was locked in those frozen continents that global sea levels were more than 120 meters lower than they are today. If one could stand on the ancient shores of that world, the view would be unrecognizable. The English Channel did not exist. Instead, a wide grassy plain connected Britain to Europe, where mammoths and reindeer grazed beneath grey skies. The Persian Gulf was a dry valley with rivers winding toward what would one day be the Arabian Sea. Between Siberia and Alaska stretched a vast steppe called Beringia, home to mammoths, lions, and early humans who crossed from Asia to the Americas. The air was colder, thinner, and drier, carrying fine dust blown from the glaciers. Winters were long and brutal. Summers were brief and cool. Yet even in that harshness, life thrived. Gigantic sloths lumbered across South America. Woolly rhinoceroses and saber-toothed cats hunted on the plains. The megafauna of the Pleistocene were the titans of their time, perfectly adapted to the cold. They did not know their age was ending. Humans too had adapted. Our ancestors were scattered bands of hunter-gatherers living on the edges of the great ice. They hunted reindeer, caribou, and bison, carved tools from bone and flint, and painted the walls of caves with images of the world they knew. To them, the planet seemed eternal, fixed in its rhythms of cold and thaw. But deep within the climate system, forces were shifting. Around 13,000 years ago, the warming that had been gradually melting the ice suddenly halted. The planet plunged back into near glacial conditions. Scientists call this the Younger Dryas. named after a small tundra flower whose pollen marks this cold return in sediment layers across the northern hemisphere. For more than 1,000 years, global temperatures dropped by as much as 10 degrees Celsius. In some regions, ice sheets began to advance again, then just as suddenly the cold ended. This abrupt freeze and thaw stands as one of the most dramatic climate reversals in Earth's recent history. Its cause remains one of the most fiercely debated mysteries in science. Some researchers argue that the shutdown of the Atlantic Ocean circulation, the conveyor belt that carries warm water northward, was triggered by a massive influx of fresh water from melting glaciers. Others believe the spark came from the heavens. According to the younger Dryas impact hypothesis, fragments of a disintegrating comet or meteor swarm struck the Earth's atmosphere and ice sheets around 12,900 years ago. The evidence is subtle but widespread. Microscopic spherules of melted rock, grains of iridium, traces of platinum, and nanodiamonds, tiny crystals formed only under extreme heat and pressure. These markers appear in soil layers across North America, Europe, and the Middle East, precisely at the boundary where the younger Dryas begins. If such an impact occurred, it would have been catastrophic. Firestorms would have swept across continents. Dust and soot would have darkened the sky, blocking sunlight and plunging temperatures. The impact sites, likely hidden beneath glaciers, would have unleashed torrents of meltwater. Within months, the planet could have gone from warming to freezing, throwing ecosystems into chaos. Whether by cosmic impact or oceanic disruption, the result was the same. For more than 1,000 years, the Earth was locked in cold once again. Then around 11,600 years ago, the thaw resumed, this time with terrifying speed. The ice sheets destabilized and melting from within began to collapse. Lakes the size of seas formed behind walls of ice. Rivers swelled into torrents. The oceans rose, first slowly, then in violent surges. This was the moment when memory turned to myth. To those living near the edges of the melting ice, the change would have been apocalyptic. Imagine living on a vast plain where rivers meandered peacefully one season, then watching as those same rivers became roaring walls of water. The sound alone would have been unearthly, a low thunder rolling across the horizon. For the people of that time, the flood was not global in the modern sense. It did not cover the entire Earth. Yet for them, it might as well have. Their entire world, every horizon they could see, was swallowed. Coastal camps, valleys, and lowlands were erased. Survivors fled to higher ground, carrying only what they could remember. The world's coastlines redrew themselves in decades. The most dramatic of these events may have been the collapse of glacial Lake Agassiz, an enormous freshwater body larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined. It lay across what is now central Canada, dammed by the melting edge of the Laurentide ice sheet. At some point, perhaps 11,700 years ago, those icy dams failed. The lake emptied catastrophically, releasing thousands of cubic kilometers of water in a matter of days. The surge raced across the continent, carving canyons, scouring bedrock, and flooding into the Atlantic. The evidence of this disaster still scars the land. The giant ripple marks of Washington's channeled scablands, the massive coulees of Montana, and the dry cataracts of the Columbia Plateau all speak of floods that defy imagination. Entire valleys were stripped to the bone in days, not millennia. The energy released by those walls of water was equivalent to millions of atomic bombs. As the waters poured into the oceans, sea levels spiked. In geological records, this event aligns with what scientists call Meltwater Pulse 1b, a sudden, rapid rise in global sea level around 11,500 years ago. It followed an earlier surge, Meltwater Pulse 1a, that occurred roughly 3,000 years before. These pulses reshaped the world's coastlines, drowning continental shelves and severing land bridges. For humans living along those vanishing coasts, there would have been no doubt. The world was ending. Villages that once stood by rivers found themselves submerged beneath salt water. Hills became islands. Entire cultures disappeared beneath the waves, leaving no trace except the stories passed down through generations. In the centuries that followed, as the climate stabilized and the Holocene epoch began, people rebuilt. But the memory of what had happened never faded. It became the shared inheritance of humanity, a warning encoded in myth. The stories of the flood carried the echo of real events, translated into the language of gods and heroes because ordinary words could not contain their magnitude. The rocks, the ice, and the fossils confirm what the myths could only suggest. Something extraordinary happened at the end of the last ice age. The earth shuddered, the waters rose, and a new world emerged from the wreckage of the old. When the world thawed, it did not do so gently. It was as if the planet exhaled after holding its breath for millennia. The glaciers retreated, the air grew wetter and warmer, and the seas surged upward with unstoppable force. The age of ice was over, and in its melting came the birth of every coastline we know today. For the people who lived through it, the transformation must have felt supernatural. In the span of a few human lifetimes, entire landscapes vanished. Rivers changed direction. Forests expanded into once frozen plains. Where once mammoths roamed, new wetlands teemed with fish and birds. But the cost of that rebirth was devastation. The floodwaters that sculpted the modern world were not slow tides. They were cataclysmic torrents that drowned valleys, carved canyons, and swallowed civilizations that would never be remembered except in story. Sea levels rose by more than 120 meters as the ice sheets of North America and Eurasia melted into the ocean. This rise did not occur in one smooth ascent. It came in pulses, bursts of acceleration that scientists can still read in coral reefs and sediment cores. Meltwater Pulse 1A, about 14,600 years ago, lifted the seas by nearly 20 meters in a few centuries. Meltwater Pulse 1B, roughly 11,500 years ago, added another 20 meters. For anyone living along ancient coastlines, these were not geological curiosities. They were the end of the world. The ocean's encroachment consumed the continental shelves, the once fertile plains that had been humanity's first homelands. In northern Europe, Doggerland disappeared beneath the rising North Sea, taking with it the reindeer hunters and foragers who had called it home. In Southeast Asia, the vast realm of Sundaland, now fragmented into the islands of Indonesia, was drowned. Forests and rivers that stretched from Vietnam to Java vanished beneath the tropical waves. In the far north, the land bridge of Beringia was submerged, isolating the early peoples of the Americas from their kin in Asia. Everywhere, the boundaries of human existence shifted. To survive, people retreated to higher ground, settling along new shorelines that would in turn one day become ancient. Each generation inherited the memory of the flood, its terror and awe, and passed it onward. When we read the world's earliest myths, we are hearing those voices whispering across 12 millennia. Consider what they saw. Great chunks of ice collapsed into the ocean, releasing waves that crossed entire seas. Rivers that had once flowed calmly to the coast suddenly met rising tides and flooded their deltas. The Mediterranean may have filled rapidly when Atlantic waters broke through the narrow Strait of Gibraltar, drowning what had been dry plains between Africa and Europe. In the Black Sea region, oceanographers have found evidence that around 7,000 years ago, the rising Mediterranean burst through the Bosporus, flooding a vast freshwater lake and transforming it into the saltwater sea we know today. Some scientists believe that this very event, violent, sudden, and world-changing, became the direct ancestor of the flood story in Mesopotamian myth. Yet the flood was not a single event. It was a long sequence of convulsions, triggered by the chaotic retreat of the ice. The meltwater did not merely fill the seas, it reshaped the climate itself. As glaciers vanished, the weight that had pressed down continents lifted, and the crust began to rebound upward. Rivers carved new paths. The balance of wind and ocean currents shifted. Rainfall patterns changed, transforming deserts into grasslands and grasslands into forests. The very blueprint of life on Earth was rewritten. The archaeological record bears witness to humanity's adaptation. As old territories disappeared, new ones emerged. In the river valleys of Mesopotamia, people began to settle permanently, using the annual floods of the Tigris and Euphrates to irrigate crops. Along the Nile, the rhythm of inundation became a calendar, a measure of life itself. In the Indus Valley, in China's Yellow River Basin, and later in the Americas, floodplains became the cradles of civilization. The very thing that had once destroyed entire worlds now nurtured new ones. But before that rebirth came centuries of wandering. The survivors of drowned lands carried their stories with them, of gods who sent water to punish arrogance, of mountains that became islands, of birds released to find land after endless rain. These were not inventions of imagination, but attempts to explain trauma. The people of the early Holocene were the children of catastrophe. Their myths were memories, encoded in poetry so they would never fade. Geologists now map those lost coastlines with sonar and satellite. They find river channels and valleys buried beneath silt and coral. Off the coast of India, near modern Dwarka, ruins of ancient structures lie submerged beneath the Arabian Sea. Off the coast of Japan, the stone terraces of Yonaguni rise from the ocean floor, their shapes still debated between natural formation and human design. In the Persian Gulf, sediment analysis reveals that a lush, habitable plain once existed before the waters advanced. These discoveries hint that the world before the flood was more populated, more complex, and more connected than we once imagined. As the ice melted, the planet's reflectivity decreased and the atmosphere filled with water vapor, amplifying the warming. The process fed upon itself, accelerating until the ice sheets vanished almost completely. Within a few thousand years, the Earth entered the climate stability of the Holocene, the relatively calm interglacial period that allowed civilization to emerge. To us, it seems permanent, yet it is only a pause between extremes. The flood, then, was not merely a disaster. It was the threshold between eras, the end of one world and the beginning of another. It washed away the last remnants of the Pleistocene, erasing the landscapes of mammoths and giant sloths, and it gave rise to the geography of our own time. The flood was the womb of civilization. Every myth remembers it differently. Some tell of divine retribution, others of cosmic cycles, or the cleansing of corruption. But beneath the variations lies a shared truth. Humanity experienced an overwhelming transformation of its environment, and that memory has never faded. The Deluge is part of our species' collective DNA, a warning written in water. The oceans today still whisper that memory. Beneath their waves lie the drowned plains and river mouths of our forgotten ancestors. The same processes that raised the seas once are rising again, this time by our own hand. The story that began 12,000 years ago has not ended. It continues with every melting glacier and every rising tide. To understand where it began, we must look backward into the cold heart of the younger Dryas. There, among the frozen dust and buried impact markers, lies the secret of what truly caused the flood, the spark that froze the world and set the stage for its catastrophic thaw. The rocks remember, even when we forget, and within that memory, written in glass, carbon, and ice, is the tale of the day the heavens may have struck the earth. Before the water rose, the world was unrecognizable. The continents we know today were still shrouded in ice, their edges extending far beyond their modern shorelines. The air carried a chill sharp enough to carve breath into frost. Wind swept across tundra plains where herds of mammoth and bison grazed, their heavy silhouettes moving like shadows over a land of white and silver. It was the late Pleistocene, an age of giants, and it would be the last time such creatures ruled the earth. Across the northern hemisphere, glaciers towered higher than mountains, pressing down with unimaginable weight. The Laurentide ice sheet, a frozen empire larger than the modern United States, sprawled across North America, its southern edge reaching as far as the present-day Ohio River. To the east, the Fennoscandian ice sheet covered most of northern Europe. Each was a monument to cold, kilometers thick, their surfaces glittering under a pale sun. Beneath them, the planet groaned. So much water was trapped in those icy fortresses that the sea lay 120 meters lower than today. Coastlines stretched hundreds of kilometers farther out, exposing vast coastal plains. These lands, now hidden beneath waves, were the heart of the human world. The English Channel was not yet a sea, but a broad valley filled with rivers and meadows connecting Europe and Britain. In Asia, the Sunda Shelf joined the islands of Indonesia, the Philippines and Malaysia into a single immense tropical subcontinent. Between Siberia and Alaska, a wide grassland bridge called Beringia linked two worlds, allowing humans and animals to cross freely. The people of this time were wanderers. They followed herds, camped beside meltwater rivers, and fished in lakes that no longer exist. Their fires burned against winds that carried dust from the glaciers, fine as flour, coating the plains in grey. They hunted mammoths with stone-tipped spears and trapped caribou in seasonal migrations. They lived close to the edge of survival, but they were not primitive. They understood the sky, the rhythms of animals, the taste of minerals in water that told where herds would pass. They carried with them stories older than language itself. The Pleistocene world was not a frozen wasteland everywhere. Beyond the reach of the ice, the equatorial zones flourished. Africa's savannas teemed with life. South America held its own giants, ground sloths as large as elephants, glyptodons armoured like tanks, and fearsome saber-toothed predators. The planet's ecosystems were vast, interconnected tapestries, each depending on the delicate balance of temperature and rainfall maintained by the global climate. But that balance was beginning to fail. Around 15,000 years ago, the Earth began to warm. The great ice sheets started to retreat, their meltwater feeding immense glacial lakes. Rivers swelled and cut new channels across the continents. The air grew more humid, and forests began to creep northward, into lands once barren. Humanity expanded with them, populating the newly exposed plains. Then, without warning, the warming stopped. In an instant, measured not by eons but by seasons, the planet plunged back into cold. This was the Younger Dryas, a return to glacial conditions that defied explanation. Across the northern hemisphere, temperatures fell by as much as 10 degrees Celsius. Grasslands turned back to tundra. Forests died. Animals starved. The ice, which had been retreating, advanced again. It was as though the planet had drawn back from spring into a final desperate winter. The cause of this reversal remains one of the greatest puzzles in science. One theory suggests that a colossal flood of fresh water, released from melting ice, poured into the North Atlantic and disrupted the ocean's circulation. The Atlantic Meridional Overturning Current, the conveyor belt of warm water that keeps Europe temperate, may have collapsed. Without its heat, the northern hemisphere froze. But there is another possibility, one written in fire rather than water. In 2007, a team of scientists proposed the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. They argued that fragments of a comet or meteor swarm struck the Earth around 12,900 years ago. Evidence for this catastrophe lies buried in sediments across the world. Microscopic spherules of glassy rock, nanodiamonds formed under extreme pressure, and traces of rare metals like iridium and platinum. These materials appear in a thin layer of soil known as the Younger Dryas boundary, marking the exact point when the planet's climate changed. If true, the implications are staggering. Imagine a swarm of icy fragments entering the atmosphere, exploding with the force of thousands of nuclear blasts. The sky would have filled with incandescent streaks. Shockwaves would have ignited wildfires across continents. Dust and soot would have blotted out the sun. The glaciers, struck by heat and pressure, would have melted from above while freezing returned below. The Earth's climate would have been thrown into chaos. The result was devastation. The megafauna that had ruled for millennia began to vanish. Mammoths, mastodons, and giant sloths disappeared in what scientists call the quaternary extinction event. Human populations dwindled in the cold, forced to migrate or perish. The planet itself seemed to hold its breath once more. For more than 1,000 years, the world remained locked in that unnatural winter. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the Younger Dryas ended. Temperatures soared, ice melted on a planetary scale. The trapped waters building behind fragile ice dams burst forth in floods so immense that they rewrote the map of the Earth. Those who lived through it must have thought the gods had turned against them. Rivers swelled into inland seas. Thunder echoed not from storms, but from the collapse of glaciers. Entire landscapes vanished under torrents of meltwater. The sea rose metre by metre, year by year, until the ancient coastlines were gone. When we read the oldest myths, the Deluge of Gilgamesh, the story of Noah, the flood of Manu, and the Greek legend of Deucalion, we are not reading fantasy. We are reading the human memory of that transformation, encoded in the only language that could survive 12,000 years: story. To find the truth behind those stories, we must step into the time just before the flood, when the world was poised on the edge of its final thaw. There, in the silence of the glaciers and the tension of the frozen air, the seeds of catastrophe were already growing. The ice had begun to melt, the lakes had begun to form, and beneath the cold, calm surface, pressure was building. Something was about to break. The last age of ice was not a frozen stillness, but a restless equilibrium. The glaciers moved like slow rivers, grinding mountains into dust and carving valleys that would one day hold rivers and cities. Every year, they advanced or retreated by small measures, and every movement changed the world. Beneath them, the crust bent and groaned under unimaginable weight. When the ice finally began to melt, the Earth itself would rise again, a process still unfolding today, long after the glaciers vanished. In this frozen landscape, the balance between life and death was delicate. The great herds of mammoth and bison wandered the steppe tundra in vast migrations, following the seasonal growth of grass that sprouted briefly during the short summers. Predators followed them: wolves, cave lions, saber-toothed cats. Birds filled the sky in warmer months, migrating south as the ice returned. For humans, every day was an act of adaptation. They hunted, scavenged, gathered roots and berries, and watched the heavens. There were no empires then, no writing, no temples. But there was memory. Around campfires, flickering in the shadows of glaciers, people told stories of the spirits in the sky, of the ancestors who walked before them, and of the mysterious power of water, the element that both nourished and destroyed. For them, the world was alive, a breathing thing. The ice was not merely frozen water, but a living boundary between realms, a wall between life and death. They could not know that those walls were weakening. The sun's energy, shifting subtly due to orbital cycles, began to warm the northern hemisphere. The ice sheets melted from below as rivers of dark meltwater tunneled through them. Massive lakes formed along their southern margins, held back only by fragile ridges of ice and earth. These were the silent reservoirs of catastrophe, waiting for the moment of release. One of these was glacial Lake Agassiz, a body of water so vast it dwarfed any modern lake. At its height, it covered an area larger than all the Great Lakes combined. It stretched from the Dakotas to Manitoba, from Saskatchewan to Ontario. It was held in place by the Laurentide ice sheet to the north and by a low ridge of land to the south. Its waters were cold and heavy, pressing outward against their frozen prison. To the west, in what is now Montana, another lake, glacial Lake Missoula, formed and vanished repeatedly. Each time, an ice dam would block the flow of meltwater. Each time, the pressure would build until the dam failed in a burst of violence beyond imagining. The floodwaters thundered across the Columbia Plateau, stripping soil and rock, carving deep coulees and immense channels. When geologists first studied those landforms in the 20th century, they could not believe water alone had shaped them, but the evidence was undeniable. The Missoula floods were among the most powerful geological events in North American history, and yet these were only fragments of a far greater story. When the world warmed again around 11,600 years ago, the ice sheets collapsed across continents. The stored waters of thousands of years of glaciation were released in a geological instant. The planet entered a phase of violent transition, rivers redrawing themselves, coastlines retreating, seas rising. Humanity stood witness to these transformations. They saw valleys turn to lakes, lakes to seas, and once distant islands become part of the mainland. They watched as animal migrations shifted, as the great herds disappeared, as forests took root in tundra soil. For them, it must have felt like creation and destruction happening together, a world dying and being born again. It was during this period that something remarkable appeared, signs of organized worship, the first true monuments to unseen powers. The oldest known temple on Earth, Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, was built around 9,600 years before the Common Era, precisely at the end of the Younger Dryas and the beginning of the Holocene. There, on a barren hill, hunter-gatherers erected massive stone pillars carved with images of animals, lions, vultures, snakes and boars. It was a temple to the memory of survival, a monument to the moment the world changed. Some archaeologists suggest Göbekli Tepe may have been a response to the flood, a sacred site where the survivors of that age gathered to remember and to honor the forces that spared them. The people who built it were still nomads, yet they labored for generations to create something permanent, as if to anchor themselves in a world that had shifted beneath their feet. It was the first whisper of civilization, born from the trauma of catastrophe. At the same time, elsewhere across the world, new forms of life and culture began to emerge. In the Fertile Crescent, the ancestors of the Sumerians cultivated wild grains. Along the Nile, nomadic tribes learned the rhythm of the river's annual flood. In China's Yellow River Basin, early farmers tamed millet and rice. In the Americas, small groups of humans, long separated from their Asian kin by the rising seas, spread across two continents rich in game but destined for their own upheavals. The Ice Age had been humanity's crucible. It taught endurance, patience, and unity. But the flood that ended it would become humanity's mythic inheritance. Those who survived passed down not only the memory of ice and fire, but also the lessons of renewal, that from the ruins of the old world, new worlds could be built. The animals that once defined the Pleistocene faded from memory. The mammoth, the saber-tooth, the woolly rhinoceros, all vanished. In their absence, humans filled the ecological void, spreading across every habitable region. With them spread the stories of the time when the sea rose, when the earth trembled, when the sky burned. The flood became a symbol of divine reckoning, because it had been a reckoning indeed, one written in ice, rock, and human fear. By the time the Holocene began, the climate had stabilized into the warmth we know today. The glaciers retreated to the poles, the forest returned, the rains came, humanity's numbers grew, and with them came memory transformed into culture. The flood stories endured, repeated across generations, not as scientific fact, but as sacred truth. They were humanity's way of remembering the moment when everything changed. In the quiet of the modern age, we can still hear the echoes. Beneath the waves lie the remnants of that vanished world, the plains of Doggerland, the valleys of Sunderland, the lost rivers of the Persian Gulf. They are the tombs of an age erased by water, and in their silence they remind us that the flood was not just a myth, but a memory carved into the bones of our species. What came next was the culmination of all those forces, the moment when the ice dams finally broke, when the waters burst forth and reshaped the earth in a matter of days. It was the day when the frozen heart of the world melted, and the flood began in earnest. The final days of the Ice Age were violent and brief. What had been slow and glacial became fast and thunderous. Ice, having ruled the earth for millennia, succumbed to warmth in an orgy of collapse. The sound of it must have echoed across continents. The roar of breaking dams, the rush of meltwater coursing through valleys, the deep groaning of glaciers surrendering to gravity. The end of the Pleistocene was not a quiet thaw, but a cataclysm of water and stone. Across North America, the Great Lakes that had formed along the margins of the retreating ice began to fail one after another. The largest, Lake Agassiz, burst its frozen barriers more than once. Each time it released torrents that scoured the land and altered the oceans. One outburst flowed south into the Mississippi Basin, turning valleys into temporary seas. Another tore eastward through the Great Lakes region, flooding into the St. Lawrence and then the North Atlantic. The effect on the global climate was immediate. Freshwater poured into saltwater currents, weakening the circulation that carried heat northward. The Earth's climate, already unstable, convulsed again. The people who lived in the paths of those floods must have witnessed destruction on a scale beyond comprehension. A single outburst from Lake Agassiz would have unleashed more water than all the rivers of the world combined. Forests would have vanished overnight. Hills would have been stripped to their roots. Whole ecosystems were erased in moments. When geologists first studied these scoured landscapes thousands of years later, they mistook them for the work of glaciers or long erosion. Only in the 20th century did scientists realize the truth. They were the fingerprints of floods so immense they bordered on the mythic. Far to the west, another disaster was unfolding. In what is now the Pacific Northwest, an ice dam at the edge of the Cordilleran ice sheet held back the waters of glacial Lake Missoula. It was a fragile barrier, hundreds of meters high and doomed to fail. When it did, the result was apocalyptic. The ice shattered, and a wall of water raced across the Columbia Plateau at speeds greater than 100 kilometers per hour. Entire hills were torn apart. The land was scoured down to bedrock, leaving behind the strange labyrinth of canyons, dry waterfalls, and rippled plains we call the channeled scablands. To stand there today is to see the aftermath of fury. The coulees and dry cataracts are silent, but their shapes tell the story. They are not the product of slow erosion, but of instant violence. Scientists estimate that each Missoula flood released more than 2,000 cubic kilometers of water, enough to fill every river on Earth 20 times over. And these floods happened not once, but repeatedly, whenever the ice reformed and failed again. These North American cataclysms were mirrored in Europe and Asia. As the Scandinavian ice sheet collapsed, glacial lakes across the continent burst their bonds, sending torrents through the valleys of the Rhine and Danube. In Siberia, meltwater from the retreating ice carved enormous floodplains that still bear its marks. The same process unfolded in South America, where Andean glaciers melted into sudden surges that reshaped mountain valleys. Everywhere the ice retreated, chaos followed. The geological record captures these events in layers of silt and sand. In some places, they lie stacked like pages, each representing a separate flood. In others, the deposits are thick and coarse, marking a single overwhelming surge. Embedded within them are the remains of trees and animals swept away by the current. Mammoths, bison, even early human tools. These sediments are the world's first flood chronicles, written not in words, but in stone. For the people who lived through it, the experience must have seemed like divine wrath. Rivers became monsters, roaring and unpredictable. Valleys filled with fog and thunder as torrents tore through them. The air smelled of mud, ice, and fear. Villages and hunting grounds vanished, forcing survivors to higher ground. Those who escaped carried with them stories that would become the seed of the world's flood myths. The waters rose, the land was swallowed, only a chosen few endured. As the ice continued to vanish, the floods shifted from local to global. The melting glaciers poured into the oceans, raising sea levels faster than any time since. Entire continental shelves disappeared. The plains of Doggerland sank beneath the North Sea. The low valleys of the Persian Gulf filled with salt water. The shallow basins around Southeast Asia became the modern archipelagos of Indonesia and the Philippines. Within a few thousand years, the geography of Earth had changed completely. This was the real Great Flood, not one single wave covering the entire planet, but countless floods cascading through time and space, each a piece of the same planetary transformation. For early humans, the world seemed to unravel, its familiar boundaries erased. The sea, once distant, advanced relentlessly. Mountains that had marked the horizon became islands. The old maps, drawn in memory and myth, were useless. In some places, the rising seas came gradually enough for adaptation. People learned to fish, to build rafts, to move inland. In others, the change was too sudden. Whole communities were lost to the tides. Those who survived retold their suffering as stories of divine warning and rebirth. It was not science, but it was truth. The water had come, and it had taken everything. Even as destruction reigned, the stage was being set for renewal. The floods carved fertile plains, depositing layers of nutrient-rich silt that would later nourish agriculture. The great river valleys of Mesopotamia, the Nile, and the Indus were products of this chaos. What seemed like an ending was also a beginning. The flood cleared the canvas upon which civilization would one day paint its first cities. The Earth itself bears the scars of that moment. Ancient shorelines are etched into cliffs thousands of kilometers apart. Vast underwater canyons mark the routes of vanished rivers. Fossil beaches lie buried beneath layers of coral, proof of how fast the seas once rose. These traces tell us that the end of the Ice Age was not a peaceful retreat, but a series of cataclysms, waves of transformation that reshaped continents and redefined the limits of human imagination. The flood myths that came later were not exaggerations. They were memories of a truth too vast to be forgotten, even when the details blurred with time. The world before the flood was lost, and those who came after built their new lives in its shadow. What remains is the question that continues to haunt both myth and science. What triggered it all? Was it the slow warming of the planet, or a sudden strike from the heavens? Did the ice die from within, or was it shattered by fire? To answer that, we must look closer at the beginning of the end, the mysterious moment when something froze the warming Earth and set in motion the chain of events that would drown the world. It began not with fire, but with silence. The Earth, warmed by millennia of retreating ice, had been moving steadily toward a new equilibrium. Forests were advancing northward, rivers ran free of ice, and the great glaciers that had once dominated continents were withdrawing. Then suddenly, the warmth stopped. The planet faltered, as if something had struck it unseen. The temperature fell, not by fractions of degrees, but by entire seasons' worth of cold. Snow returned to places that had not seen it in centuries. The thaw reversed. The world froze again. This event, which scientists now call the Younger Dryas, marks one of the most dramatic climate reversals in Earth's history. It began roughly 12,900 years ago and lasted for about 1,200 years. Its onset was abrupt, geologically instantaneous. In the Greenland ice cores, the record is clear. The warming that had been underway for thousands of years ended in a single stroke. Average temperatures in the northern hemisphere plummeted by as much as 10 degrees Celsius. It was as if winter had seized the world and refused to let go. For early humans emerging from the Ice Age, the change would have been catastrophic. Crops failed before they could ripen. Game animals vanished or migrated south. Glaciers that had begun to retreat advanced again, grinding forests beneath their weight. In the north, permafrost returned to lands that had begun to bloom. In the south, droughts and storms swept across newly formed grasslands. The world had shifted into crisis. For decades, scientists debated what could have caused such a sudden and global transformation. Some proposed that the great meltwater lakes, particularly Lake Agassiz in North America, had burst their icy boundaries, releasing torrents of fresh water into the North Atlantic. This freshwater flood could have disrupted the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the system of currents that carries warm water northward and cold water southward. Without that circulation, heat would have remained trapped in the tropics, plunging the higher latitudes into cold. It is a compelling idea, supported by geological evidence of catastrophic flooding. Yet there is another hypothesis, more controversial but far more dramatic. It suggests that the Earth's sudden freeze was not caused from within, but from above. Around 12,900 years ago, according to this theory, fragments of a disintegrating comet or asteroid struck the planet. The impacts, or even the air bursts in the atmosphere, unleashed enough heat and pressure to ignite global wildfires, vaporize ice, and fill the air with dust. The sky darkened, sunlight dimmed, temperatures fell. This is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, first proposed in 2007 by a team led by Richard Firestone, Alan West, and others. They based their theory on a layer of sediment found across multiple continents, all dating to the exact beginning of the Younger Dryas. This thin boundary layer contains a unique chemical and mineral signature, high concentrations of platinum, iridium, and other rare metals associated with extraterrestrial material, magnetic spherules and melt glass that form only under extreme heat, and most intriguingly, nanodiamonds, tiny crystals that require immense pressure to form. The evidence stretches across North America, Europe, and the Middle East. At more than 50 archaeological and geological sites, This layer appears precisely where the climate record shows the abrupt return to cold. To many researchers, it looks like the fingerprint of an impact event, yet no obvious crater was known, leading skeptics to dismiss the theory as speculation. But in science, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the Earth is skilled at erasing its scars. In the years since, new discoveries have added weight to the impact hypothesis. In the ice cores of Greenland, scientists found a spike in platinum levels corresponding exactly to the onset of the younger Dryas. Platinum is rare in Earth's crust but abundant in meteorites, suggesting that extraterrestrial material was indeed deposited at that time. Meanwhile, a massive circular depression was discovered beneath the Hiawatha Glacier in northwest Greenland, a structure 30 kilometers wide, hidden under nearly a kilometer of ice. Its age is uncertain, but some evidence suggests it could date close to 12,000 years ago. If confirmed, it would be the first physical scar of the event that may have frozen the world. Imagine what such a strike would have looked like. The sky over the northern ice would have burned with streaks of fire as a fragmented comet entered the atmosphere at tens of kilometers per second. Some fragments would have exploded before reaching the ground, releasing energy equivalent to thousands of nuclear bombs. Others would have struck the ice itself, vaporizing water, blasting debris into the sky, and generating waves of meltwater that raced outward for hundreds of kilometers. The heat from the impacts could have ignited forests across continents, filling the air with soot. The sunlight would have dimmed. Photosynthesis would have stalled. Within weeks, the planet would have cooled dramatically. The environmental consequences were catastrophic. Wildfire charcoal layers found across North America and parts of Europe confirm that massive burning occurred at the onset of the younger Dryas. The air, thick with smoke and dust, would have reduced sunlight and cooled the surface. The combination of impact debris and soot created a short-lived but powerful nuclear winter effect. Glaciers, which had been melting, stabilized and began to grow again. The ocean currents faltered. The Earth entered a 1,000-year deep freeze. For human cultures living at the time, the effects were immediate and devastating. The Clovis people of North America, known for their distinctive fluted spear, points, disappeared from the archaeological record almost overnight. The megafauna they hunted, including mammoths, mastodons, and giant bison, also vanished in the same interval. In Europe and the Middle East, human settlements retreated or adapted to the sudden cold. The shift from abundance to scarcity forced migrations, conflicts, and perhaps even the birth of new myths. The comet hypothesis remains controversial. Many scientists argue that the evidence can be explained by terrestrial processes, wildfires caused by natural climate fluctuations, or minerals formed through lightning strikes or volcanic eruptions. Yet the coincidence in timing and the global distribution of the impact markers continue to challenge skepticism. Every year, new studies add fragments to the mosaic. If the younger Dryas impact hypothesis is correct, it suggests that a cosmic event not only froze the planet, but also set in motion the floods and transformations that followed. The irony is haunting. The same impact that plunged the Earth into ice may have also sown the seeds of the great floods that ended that ice. By destabilizing glaciers, melting ice from below, and altering the planet's energy balance, it set the stage for the final catastrophic melt that would come 12 centuries later. When the freeze finally ended, it did so with explosive force. The atmosphere warmed, the ice broke, and the water that had been trapped for millennia was released in a rush that would reshape the continents. The Earth had endured fire and frost, and now it would drown. The frozen centuries of the younger Dryas were a paradox of silence and violence. To the people who survived it, the sky must have seemed uncertain, the seasons unreliable, the gods untrustworthy. Every horizon looked frozen, yet somewhere deep within the glaciers, a slow fury was building. The world had been stunned by cold, but the heat was returning, waiting for the moment to break free. In Greenland, ice cores preserve the record like pages in a planetary diary. Each layer tells of snowfall, dust, and trapped air, capturing the breath of each year. In those layers, scientists see the unmistakable signature of the younger Dryas. One moment the temperature had been rising, and the next it fell sharply. Then, about 11,600 years ago, the line on the graph turned upward in an instant. The planet, after a millennium of deep freeze, warmed again with terrifying speed. It is difficult to imagine such sudden change on a planetary scale, yet the evidence is clear. Within a human lifetime, average temperatures in the northern hemisphere rose by as much as 7 degrees Celsius. The ice sheets, already unstable, began to collapse from within. Meltwater lakes trapped between layers of ice surged outward in violent torrents. The seas rose in pulses, carving away the last barriers of the Pleistocene world. To understand what this meant for those alive then, imagine a river valley somewhere on the edge of the retreating glaciers. For generations, a small community has lived by its waters, hunting reindeer and fishing in the shallows. Each spring, the ice retreats a little farther. Each year, the river runs stronger. Then one season, the thaw comes early. The snowmelt turns the river into a roar. Trees are swept away, animals vanish, and the land that had sustained them is gone. What was once home becomes a floodplain. That was life on the edge of the younger Dryas. The sudden end of the cold was not gentle, it was explosive. Glacial Lake Agassiz, the largest freshwater lake the planet has ever known, was trapped behind walls of melting ice. When its dam finally broke, the release of water was beyond imagination. Thousands of cubic kilometers of fresh water poured across the continent, carving channels hundreds of meters deep, tearing through forests and mountains, and eventually spilling into the ocean. The sound must have been like the voice of the earth itself, thunder without pause, a constant roar that shook the ground. When that fresh water reached the North Atlantic, it again disrupted the ocean's circulation. The heat distribution of the planet shifted, storms intensified, the polar vortexes twisted out of pattern. What had begun as a local collapse in one hemisphere became a global event. The Earth's weather was rewriting itself. This was the turning point, the transition from the frozen world of the Pleistocene to the warm stability of the Holocene, the age we live in now. The violence of the change etched itself into every landscape. In the Pacific Northwest, floods from melting glaciers carved the scablands, leaving behind dry waterfalls and deep, empty canyons. In the British Isles, the last remnants of Doggerland were drowned beneath the advancing North Sea. Across Asia and the Americas, low-lying plains disappeared, replaced by new coastlines that would define human geography for the next 12,000 years. Archaeological evidence shows that human life clustered near the edges of these changes. At Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, construction began almost precisely at the end of the Younger Dryas, around 9,600 years before the Common Era. There, hunter-gatherers gathered to raise towering stone pillars carved with animals, snakes, vultures, lions. No one knows exactly why they built it, but the timing is too precise to ignore. It was a response to something monumental. To live through the end of the Younger Dryas was to live through the most dramatic transformation the planet had seen since the extinction of the great reptiles. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were the inheritors of that trauma. Their monuments may have been an attempt to understand it, to create permanence in a world that had proven nothing was safe from change. Each stone was a defiance against the flood, a statement carved in limestone that humanity would remember. Meanwhile, far from Anatolia, other cultures were, also rising from the shadows of the cold. In the Fertile Crescent, small groups began domesticating wild grains. In North Africa, along the Nile, the river's regular floods left rich silt that allowed permanent settlement. In East Asia, the ancestors of future civilizations began to cultivate rice and millet in the valleys left fertile by retreating glaciers. It was as if, after the cataclysm, the planet itself invited renewal. The Younger Dryas had frozen the world, but in doing so, it had prepared the ground for civilization. By locking away water and then releasing it, by ending old ecosystems and forcing adaptation, it pushed humanity into invention. Survival required cooperation, memory, and the passing of knowledge. These were the seeds of culture. Still, the scars of the cold remained. For centuries, oral traditions told of a time when fire rained from the heavens and the world turned to ice. In many versions, the fire and the flood are not separate events but part of the same story. The heavens burn, the cold follows, and then the waters rise. This is precisely the sequence scientists reconstruct from the geological record. Impact or explosion, cooling, then catastrophic melt. The cosmic hypothesis gives these myths new resonance. A comet, fragmented and falling through Earth's atmosphere, could easily appear to ancient eyes as divine fire. The following darkness and cold would have seemed like punishment. When warmth returned and the glaciers melted, the flood would have been the final act of that divine drama. In human memory, these events blurred together, becoming one long catastrophe, a time when the sky fell and the oceans rose. Skeptics point out that impact evidence remains incomplete. No single crater has been definitively linked to the event, and some chemical traces could indeed come from earthly sources. Yet as more data accumulates, the pattern grows clearer. Nanodiamonds, melt glass, and high-temperature carbon spherules have now been found not just in North America, but in Europe, the Middle East, and even South America. The scale of the boundary layer's uniformity is difficult to explain without a global event. Even if the comet never struck directly, a massive airburst, like the one over Tunguska in Siberia in 1908, could have caused enormous atmospheric heating and pressure waves. A swarm of such explosions over ice-covered continents could easily have ignited wildfires and destabilized glaciers. The world would have burned and frozen at once. What followed was the most dramatic transformation of climate in human prehistory. The younger Dryas was the last gasp of the Ice Age, the planet's violent reset, and when it ended, it unleashed the floods that reshaped everything. In the sediment cores of lakes and oceans, the story is written with perfect precision. First, the soot and dust of global fire, then the cold, then the surge of fresh water, and finally the rise in sea level. The chain of cause and effect is unmistakable. Something struck the Earth, or something within it shifted, and the result was the flood that would haunt humanity's memory for all time. By the time the younger Dryas ended, the world that emerged was not the same as the one that froze. It was warmer, wetter, and more dynamic. Forests spread where tundra had been. Rivers found new courses. Humanity, now scattered but enduring, stepped into a world made new. The age of ice was over. The age of water had begun. The end began with the sound of breaking. Beneath the cold sky of a world still thawing from its long sleep, the ice gave way. For thousands of years it had held firm, a white wall stretched across the northern continents, containing within it the weight of half the planet's water. But ice is a patient enemy. It moves slowly, cracks quietly, and then all at once it collapses. When it did, the Earth trembled. The great ice sheets of North America and Eurasia had been retreating for centuries, melting from within as warmth crept northward. Beneath their surface, rivers of meltwater gathered in vast hidden networks, tunneling through the blue depths like veins. Each season the melt grew stronger, and each season the pressure behind the frozen dams increased. In time, that pressure reached a point no glacier could endure. What followed was a chain of floods so immense that the land itself was remade. In the heart of what is now Canada lay a freshwater ocean known to scientists as Glacial Lake Agassiz. It was larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined, a body of water that stretched for thousands of kilometers across the center of the continent. It was hemmed in by the Laurentide ice sheet to the north and by ridges of moraine and frozen ground to the south. For centuries, it had been stable. Then, around 11,700 years ago, as the world warmed at the end of the younger Dryas, the ice began to fracture. At first, the release came slowly. Meltwater seeped through cracks, carving channels that deepened over seasons. But water is relentless. Once it finds a path, it widens it, polishing ice into glass, turning fissures into rivers. One spring, perhaps under the weight of its own mass, one of Lake Agassiz's ice walls gave way. The entire lake emptied in a matter of days. The flood that followed was beyond anything the planet has seen since. Billions of tons of water surged south and east, tearing across the continent. The flow scoured valleys, moved boulders the size of houses, and carried with it entire forests. The flood carved deep channels across what is now Minnesota and the Dakotas, rushing toward the Mississippi Basin before emptying into the Atlantic. Where it met resistance, it simply erased it. Geologists today can still trace its path. They see it in the scoured plains, in the ripple marks that stretch for kilometers, in the fields of polished stone where no vegetation grows. These are not the slow works of erosion, but the fingerprints of catastrophe. The floodwaters, moving at speeds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour, had the power to reshape entire regions in the span of a single human life. Farther west, another disaster unfolded. In the shadow of the Cordilleran ice sheet, a smaller but equally destructive cycle was repeating. Here, an ice dam held back glacial Lake Missoula, a lake that would form and vanish again and again over centuries. Each time the ice reformed, it sealed a new lake. Each time, it failed. It unleashed a torrent. The Missoula floods were like the pulse of a living planet, recurring perhaps dozens of times between 15,000 and 12,000 years ago. When Lake Missoula's dam broke, the water rushed forth with unimaginable fury. In the space of a few days, it carved the strange landscape now known as the channeled scablands of Washington state. Valleys hundreds of meters deep were gouged from solid basalt. Cliffs that once marked ancient rivers were transformed into dry waterfalls taller than modern skyscrapers. The Columbia River basin was stripped bare, leaving behind a labyrinth of coulees and dry cataracts. Even the largest boulders were lifted and carried for hundreds of kilometers before being dropped like pebbles when the water's strength faltered. At the peak of the flood, water levels in the region may have reached over 600 meters above the modern valley floors. Imagine the sound, a wall of water, higher than any wave on Earth, rushing at a speed faster than a galloping horse, filled with ice, rock, and entire trees. The roar would have been constant, unending, a sound that shook mountains. For the humans who lived there, survival depended on elevation. Those caught on the plains would have seen the horizon darken, the wind change, and the earth begin to shake before they even understood what was coming. By the time they heard the roar, it was too late. Families fled uphill, carrying what they could. Those who reached higher ground would have watched as their world vanished beneath a boiling sea of mud and foam. When the waters receded, they left a landscape transformed. Rivers found new courses. Lakes appeared where valleys once had been. The soil was rich with silt and minerals, but the people who returned found nothing of what they had known. The flood had erased every sign of their past, except for memory. Similar events were happening across the world. In Europe, the collapse of the Scandinavian ice sheet released torrents through the valleys of the Rhine and the Danube. In Siberia, vast glacial lakes emptied into the Arctic Ocean, carving channels still visible today. In South America, the Andean glaciers melted in bursts that flooded entire basins. The entire planet was caught in a chain reaction of melting and release, each flood amplifying the next. The sudden influx of fresh water into the oceans triggered further chaos. The balance of salt and temperature that drives global currents was altered. The Atlantic conveyor, already weakened, shifted again. Storms became more violent. Rainfall patterns changed. In the tropics, monsoon systems expanded, bringing new fertility to some regions and devastating drought to others. What seemed like random weather was in truth the Earth trying to find equilibrium again. The floods did not merely destroy, they also created. The walls of water that scoured the continents carried with them sediment and life. When they slowed, they left behind plains of rich alluvial soil. These new lands, carved by chaos, would one day become the cradles of civilization. The valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, the Nile and the Indus, were all shaped by floods that had their origins in the end of the Ice Age. The same waters that erased ancient worlds would feed the birth of new ones. But for those who lived through the catastrophe, creation was not in their thoughts. They saw only loss. To them, the flood was divine judgment, the anger of gods whose patience had ended. In every corner of the world, survivors turned to the only tool they had to make sense of it: story. They told of the day the water came without warning, of the mountain that became an island, of the family or tribe that found refuge and lived to rebuild. Each retelling preserved a detail of the truth, each generation adding reverence where once there had been terror. Over time, these stories became the flood myths we still tell today. The physical evidence of those floods now lies scattered across the earth, silent but unambiguous. Giant ripple marks cut across dry plains in Montana and Washington, each one taller than a man. boulders from Canada resting congruously in Oregon, carried there by icebergs during the floods. Satellite imagery reveals ancient shorelines that stretch across continents. Beneath the oceans, sonar mapping shows drowned river valleys and terraces that once were coastal settlements. The sea holds the proof of every myth. Scientists have calculated that the final release of meltwater at the end of the Ice Age raised global sea levels by as much as 20 meters in a matter of centuries. For a species that lived on coasts and riverbanks, that rise was an apocalypse. Cities and camps alike were swallowed. The old world ended quietly beneath the waves. And yet, from that destruction came opportunity. As the waters receded and climates stabilized, humans found new lands, fertile and waiting. The chaos of the floods had tilled the soil of the future. Agriculture, settlement, and civilization followed. The flood was both an ending and a genesis, the planet's way of renewing itself through catastrophe. Looking back, the story of the day the ice dams broke is not only one of loss but of transformation. The Earth tore itself apart and in doing so, created the foundation of the world we now inhabit. The floods did not simply wash away. They sculpted, they seeded, they began anew. And though the people who lived through them could not have known, their terror and their endurance would echo across ages, surviving as whispers of gods and arcs, of mountains and rain, of the endless memory of water. When the ice finally began to die, it did not pass quietly. The thaw came like a fever. The Earth, having endured its long-frozen dream, woke all at once. Ice that had endured for tens of thousands of years cracked like glass beneath a torch. Mountains shed their frozen crowns. Rivers broke through their channels and poured into basins that had not known water since before humanity's birth. The glaciers did not retreat. They collapsed. As the great ice sheets melted, the oceans swelled in reply. In the geological record, scientists call this time the Great Melt, and in the memory of humankind, it became the Age of the Flood. The seas rose more than 120 meters, swallowing entire continents of land that now lie buried beneath coral and sand. Yet the rise was not slow and steady. It came in violent surges, moments of acceleration that punctuated the thaw like heartbeats. The first of these pulses occurred about 14,600 years ago and is known as Meltwater Pulse 1A. In only a few centuries, sea levels climbed nearly 20 meters. A second surge, Meltwater Pulse 1B, came about 11,500 years ago, adding another 20 meters. These pulses were global tsunamis that never stopped moving. The ancient world before the flood was a larger one. Britain was not an island, but a peninsula of Europe, joined to the mainland by Doggerland, a vast expanse of plains, rivers and forests, stretching beneath what is now the North Sea. Farther east, the landmass called Sunderland joined the modern islands of Indonesia, Malaysia and the Philippines into a single tropical continent. In the north, the wide steppe of Beringia connected Asia and North America, while the Persian Gulf was a fertile valley threaded with rivers flowing into a small inland sea. To the people who lived on these lands, the world seemed endless, yet these were the places first claimed by the rising water. In the shallows where the North Sea now rolls, hunters once followed herds across grassy plains. They built camps along rivers where fish leapt in abundance. Then one spring, the tide came farther inland. By the next, the shoreline had shifted beyond recognition. Within generations, their hunting grounds were gone. The same fate came to Sunderland, where lush river valleys became archipelagos. The people who had lived among the tropical forests of that drowned continent must have watched in disbelief as the sea crept inland year by year, taking their fields and their homes, their temples and their ancestors' graves. The rising seas were not gentle. Each pulse of meltwater came as the final surrender of a dying glacier. When the ice collapsed, it released walls of water that rolled outward across the continents. Valleys flooded, islands vanished, and coastal plains disappeared beneath the waves. The rising was global, but to each tribe and settlement it seemed personal. Their world was ending. The oceans are a patient historian. Beneath their surface lie the outlines of these lost worlds, perfectly preserved in silence. Sonar mapping has revealed drowned shorelines, river channels and terraces carved by waves that no longer reach them. Off the coast of India, near the modern city of Dwarka, lie the remains of ancient walls and streets now buried beneath mud and coral. In the waters off Japan's Yonaguni Island, massive stone formations shaped into terraces and steps rise from the seafloor, their geometry too precise for coincidence. Off the coast of the Arabian Peninsula, in what was once the Persian Gulf oasis, sediment cores reveal traces of ancient freshwater marshes that existed before the flood. These are the footprints of forgotten civilizations erased by the rising tide. To the people of the Late Ice Age, the transformation of the world was more than environmental. It was spiritual. The sea was alive, an entity that advanced with will and intent. It came in silence, then roared, then fell silent again, leaving behind nothing but foam and bones. The myths that later emerged in every culture carry this same tone of reverence and terror. The flood was not simply water. It was judgment, renewal, and memory made one. The science of paleoclimatology confirms what those myths suggest. The melt was not uniform. It varied across hemispheres, responding to regional climate patterns and orbital shifts. In some places, the warming was rapid, driven by feedback loops of sunlight and ice reflectivity. In others, it lagged, slowed by clouds or volcanic ash. But the overall trend was relentless. The Earth was heating, and the ice had no refuge left. The impact of the melt was not confined to geography. It reshaped the planet's entire system. As ice turned to water, the weight pressing down on continents lifted, and the crust began to rise. The oceans, heavier and more expansive, pressed into their basins, changing the tilt of the planet's rotation. Weather patterns shifted. The atmosphere filled with moisture, feeding monsoon systems across Africa and Asia. Rainforests expanded, deserts migrated. What had been a world of ice and wind became one of rivers and storms. This great rearrangement did not happen without consequence for life. The final extinction of the Pleistocene megafauna coincides with the Great Melt. The mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, and saber-toothed cats all vanished. Some perished in the cold of the younger Dryas, but many were swept away in the floods that followed. Their bones, found in tangled masses in ancient riverbeds, tell the story of animals caught mid-flight, drowned by torrents they could not escape. Humanity survived by moving. The people of Doggerland retreated to the higher hills that would become Britain. The peoples of Beringia crossed into the Americas before their bridge was drowned. Along the retreating coasts of Asia and the Pacific, seafaring began. Necessity gave birth to navigation, the flood forced invention. Those who adapted carried their knowledge forward, becoming the ancestors of the civilizations that would rise when the waters calmed. The Great Melt was not a singular event, but a crescendo. For thousands of years, the Earth oscillated between chaos and calm. Each surge of warmth released more water, which in turn altered the balance of the atmosphere and oceans. By 11,000 years ago, the climate had stabilized enough to mark the beginning of the Holocene, the epoch of warmth and stability, in which all of human civilization has unfolded. In this new era, the world's map was redrawn. The Mediterranean filled, connecting to the Atlantic through the narrow Strait of Gibraltar. The Black Sea, once a freshwater lake, was overwhelmed by salt water rushing through the Bosporus, flooding the lands where people had farmed and fished for generations. The legend of a great flood in that region, recorded later in Mesopotamian and biblical traditions, may be the echo of that disaster. From the perspective of geology, these were natural processes, the inevitable pulse of a warming planet. But to those who lived through it, it was apocalypse. Their sense of time was not measured in millennia, but in lifetimes. And within those lifetimes, the sea rose, the rivers shifted, and the known world shrank. When archaeologists uncover traces of human settlements along these ancient coasts, they find tools, pottery, and sometimes footprints, marks of lives lived on the edge of the rising deep. The people who left them could not have imagined that their world would one day lie beneath hundreds of meters of ocean, yet the evidence shows they adapted, they endured, and they remembered. The myths they carried became the bridges between memory and history. In every story of a flood sent by gods, of a hero who builds a vessel, of birds sent out to find land, we hear the same human response to loss and survival. Those stories were born here, in this time of melting ice and rising water. They were the first science of the human spirit, the attempt to explain what the sky and the earth had done. The great melt ended not in fire or ice, but in balance. When the last of the glaciers withdrew into the high latitudes, the earth entered an age of warmth unlike anything the people of the Ice Age had ever known. Forests spread across continents, rivers found steady courses. The seas, though higher, grew calm. The planet exhaled. The catastrophe was over, but it left a memory that would never fade. The flood had taken everything, the land, the animals, the old ways, and given back only the knowledge that the world could change in an instant. Humanity emerged from that crucible stronger, more inventive, and forever aware of its fragility. The oceans still whisper that memory. Their tides trace the rhythm of a planet that once drowned itself to begin again. And though the ice of that age is gone, the pattern remains. For the earth, every flood is a beginning. The waters receded, but the memory of their fury remained. When the ice retreated to the poles and the earth grew warm again, the world that emerged was unrecognizable. Whole continents had changed shape, coastlines had redrawn themselves, and valleys that had once echoed with the calls of mammoth and bison now lay silent beneath the sea. Yet even as nature buried the evidence of its violence, traces of that lost world lingered, buried beneath mud, hidden in stone, and encoded in the oldest monuments of humankind. These remnants, scattered across the earth, form the archaeological echo of the Great Flood. Along the shallow continental shelves that now lie beneath the waves, entire landscapes rest, preserved in silt and sand. Modern sonar surveys have revealed riverbeds, hills, and terraces that match those of terrestrial valleys. They are the ghosts of lands that existed before the sea rose, and in some places they hold the remains of the people who lived there. Off the coast of India, near the modern city of Dwarka, divers have mapped what appear to be walls, streets, and foundations buried beneath layers of sediment. Radiocarbon samples from the area suggest that parts of these structures may predate recorded history, perhaps dating back more than 9,000 years before the Common Era. The site lies precisely where sea levels would have been during the final melt of the Ice Age, as though it were frozen in time at the moment the ocean claimed it. In the waters near Japan's Yonaguni Island, another mystery lies beneath the waves, a vast complex of stone terraces, platforms and steps rising from the seafloor. Some geologists argue that these formations are natural, shaped by tectonic processes and erosion, but others point to the sharp angles, straight edges and deliberate symmetry of the structures as evidence of human craftsmanship. If even part of the Yonaguni monument was carved by human hands, it would push the origins of complex architecture back thousands of years before the accepted dawn of civilization. Farther west, under the shallow waters of the Persian Gulf, scientists have discovered what may have been one of humanity's earliest refuges. Before the flood, this region was not an ocean, but a vast and fertile valley watered by the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun and Wadi Batin rivers. It was a lush basin of marshes and lakes, a cradle for the peoples who would later settle Mesopotamia. Sediment cores taken from the Gulf floor show layers of freshwater diatoms and pollen from land plants, proof that a river-fed ecosystem once flourished there. When the rising seas finally broke through the Strait of Hormuz around 12,000 years ago, the valley was inundated. Its inhabitants fled north to higher ground, carrying with them their crops, their animals, and their stories. Centuries later, those stories would become the myths of Sumer and Babylon, the tales of Ziusudra and Utnapishtim, of divine warnings and boats built to outlast the flood. The pattern repeats itself across continents. Off the coast of Britain, beneath the North Sea, lies Doggerland, once a fertile plain connecting the island to Europe. There, archaeologists have dredged up stone tools, bones and traces of ancient settlements. The sediments of Doggerland reveal forests, rivers and lakes that existed before the sea advanced. Around 8,000 years ago, A final surge of water swept through the region, perhaps triggered by the Storegga slide, a massive undersea landslide off the coast of Norway that sent a tsunami racing across the North Atlantic. The wave would have been tens of meters high when it struck the low-lying plains of Doggerland, drowning the last communities that still lived there. The story was the same in Southeast Asia, where the great landmass of Sundaland, now fragmented into the islands of Indonesia and Malaysia, once connected the Asian mainland to the Western Pacific. Its valleys and deltas, now submerged beneath the Java and South China Seas, were home to rivers larger than the Ganges or the Mekong. Genetic and linguistic studies of the region's peoples suggest that waves of migration followed the pattern of the rising seas, as ancient coastal populations were forced inland or out to sea. The oral traditions of many island cultures still tell of ancestral homelands that sank beneath the ocean, lands of great forests and shining mountains that vanished in the time of their forebears. For thousands of years, the flood was not just memory, it was experience. Each generation watched the sea advance. Each new shoreline became a reminder of impermanence. This constant retreat from the coast imprinted itself on humanity's earliest architecture. The first permanent sanctuaries were not built on the shores but on high hills, as though people had learned that the sea could never be trusted. The most striking of these sanctuaries stands in modern-day Turkey, on a limestone ridge overlooking the ancient plains of Mesopotamia. It is called Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is one of archaeology's greatest enigmas. Built around 9,600 years before the Common Era, it predates Stonehenge by more than 6 millennia, and the Egyptian pyramids by nearly 7. The site consists of massive circular enclosures filled with T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing more than 50 tons. Many of the pillars are carved with reliefs of animals, snakes, scorpions, vultures, boars and foxes, arranged in deliberate patterns. The site shows no evidence of domestic life. It was not a village or a fortress. It was a place of gathering, of worship, or perhaps of mourning. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were still hunter-gatherers. They had no pottery, no metal, no writing. Yet they moved stone on a monumental scale, coordinating labour and vision in a way that hints at a sudden leap in human organisation. It was as if something had driven them to create permanence in a world that had proved impermanent. Many archaeologists now believe the temple was built as a response to the cataclysm that ended the Ice Age. Its carvings, filled with imagery of water and celestial symbols, may be the first written memory of the flood, the first attempt to capture in stone the story of survival. Göbekli Tepe stands precisely at the threshold of the Holocene, when the younger Dryas colds snapped into sudden warmth, and when the meltwater floods swept across the continents. This coincidence in timing cannot easily be ignored. It suggests that the builders of Göbekli Tepe were witnesses, or descendants of witnesses, to the cataclysm that reshaped their world. In their carvings, they left a message not of despair, but of rebirth. Elsewhere, other sites tell similar tales. In Egypt's desert plateaus, engravings of fish and boats appear in places that are now bone dry, remnants of rivers that once flowed where only sand remains. In the highlands of Peru and Bolivia, early settlements cluster near ancient shorelines, marking the former levels of lakes swollen by meltwater. Across the Americas, stone alignments and ceremonial mounds echo the patterns of stars and horizons, perhaps memorials to the lost lands beneath the western seas. Even in the myths of cultures separated by oceans, a strange consistency emerges. The people of the Andes tell of a flood sent by Viracocha to cleanse the world. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia speak of the time when the sea rose to swallow the coastal hunting grounds. In China, ancient records speak of Emperor Yu, who tamed the floodwaters that once covered the land. In the Middle East, the Sumerians wrote of Ziusudra, the survivor of the deluge sent by the gods, and in the hills of the Levant, later peoples would tell of Noah, the chosen man who preserved life through the storm. Each story is unique in its details, yet they share the same heartbeat: the memory of drowning, the terror of survival, the gratitude of renewal. These are not coincidences. They are fragments of a single global experience, scattered and reshaped by distance and time. The archaeological record, once dismissed as coincidence, now aligns with those myths. Together, they speak of a real flood, not as a single event, but as an era of upheaval that united all of humanity in loss and remembrance. In the centuries that followed the flood, humanity's relationship with water changed forever. Rivers became sacred, seas became boundaries, and mountains became symbols of refuge. The flood had shown that the world could be taken away, and so people built, recorded, and remembered. The rise of temples, the invention of writing, and the birth of civilization itself may all have been responses to that ancient fear, the need to make something endure when the world refused to. Archaeology gives form to that fear. Every stone pulled from the silt, every artifact raised from the seafloor, is a message from those who lived through the Great Flood. They remind us that we are the descendants of survivors, that our civilizations were born not in stability but in chaos. The flood erased the old world, but it also gave us the story of beginnings, the story that would echo through every culture to come as both warning and hope. Long after the waters receded, the memory of the flood refused to fade. It persisted not in stone nor in sediment, but in words. Songs, prayers, and stories passed from voice to voice across the ages. Humanity's oldest inheritance is not gold or tools or monuments. It is memory, wrapped in myth. And in every corner of the world, that memory speaks of the same thing, a great flood that destroyed the old world and began the new. The earliest written record of this story comes from Sumer, the land between the rivers. On clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform signs, scribes preserved the tale of Ziusudra, the man who survived the deluge sent by the gods. In that story, the gods, angered by human noise and pride, decide to drown the world. One deity, sympathetic to humankind, warns Ziusudra in a dream, instructing him to build a great vessel, to gather his family, and to preserve the seeds of all living things. When the flood comes, it covers even the mountains. For 7 days and 7 nights, the boat drifts over a world of water. Then the rain ceases, the waters subside, and Ziusudra releases birds to search for land. When one does not return, he knows the earth is restored. He builds an altar and offers thanks, and the gods, moved by his devotion, grant him immortality. This story was retold centuries later in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the flood survivor becomes Utnapishtim, the immortal who reveals to Gilgamesh the secret of life and death. In both tales, the flood is not merely punishment, it is purification. The world must drown so that it may be reborn. From Mesopotamia, the myth spread like the floodwaters themselves. In the Hebrew tradition, it became the story of Noah. In the book of Genesis, the pattern is almost identical. Divine warning, construction of an ark, the gathering of animals, the rain that lasts 40 days, the release of birds, and the covenant symbolized by a rainbow. The echo between Utnapishtim and Noah is too precise to be coincidence. It is the same story, reshaped by faith, carried across generations like a relic of the catastrophe that birthed civilization. But the flood's memory is not confined to the Fertile Crescent. In Greece, the myth became the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, the last man and woman who survived when Zeus sent a deluge to destroy humankind. They drifted in a chest for 9 days until they came to rest on Mount Parnassus. From the stones they cast behind them sprang a new human race. In India, the same theme appears in the tale of Manu, the primordial man warned by a fish, an avatar of the god Vishnu, that a flood would soon engulf the world. Manu builds a great boat, ties it to the horn of the fish, and survives to repopulate the earth. In China, ancient texts tell of the great flood that covered the land for years, until the hero Yu tamed it, digging channels to guide the waters back to the sea. In the Americas, the Hopi speak of a world destroyed by flood when people forgot their balance with nature, and of a few who escaped in hollow reeds. The Maya, the Ojibwe, the Inca, the Polynesians, and the Aboriginal Australians all preserve versions of the same event. This extraordinary convergence of myth across continents raises a question too large to ignore. Did so many cultures invent the same story by chance, or were they all remembering the same catastrophe? To dismiss the flood as mere coincidence is to underestimate the precision with which ancient people remembered the Earth. Modern science tells us that the end of the Ice Age brought rising seas that swallowed the coastlines where early humans lived. Between 14,000 and 7,000 years ago, more than 10 million square kilometers of land disappeared beneath the oceans. The trauma of those centuries would have seared itself into collective memory. Oral traditions carried across generations can preserve real events for millennia. Anthropologists studying indigenous Australian stories, for instance, have found references to coastal flooding that align with geological data from more than 10,000 years ago. Myths, in this light, are not fictions. They are time capsules of experience. The flood, therefore, may not be a single event, but a collective memory of many. Each culture witnessed its own version: the drowning of Doggerland, the inundation of the Persian Gulf Valley, the breaching of the Black Sea Basin, the loss of Sunderland. These were separate tragedies bound together by their timing, their scale, and their emotional imprint. To ancient eyes, these were not local disasters. They were the end of the world. In the language of myth, water is always the agent of renewal. It erases, but also cleanses. The flood myths thus preserve not only fear but hope, the idea that from destruction comes rebirth. Noah's rainbow, Deucalion stones, Yu's channels, and Manu's fish all symbolize survival through understanding, through balance with nature's power. The gods who send the flood are not only destroyers, they are teachers. Across the ages, the story of the flood evolved with each retelling. In Mesopotamia, it became a tale of divine justice. In Israel, a covenant of mercy. In Greece, a story of rebirth. In India and China, a parable of harmony. The details changed, but the message endured. Humanity's fate is bound to the waters, and those who respect them may endure their wrath. There is something profoundly human in this continuity. We fear what we cannot control, yet we transform that fear into meaning. The storytellers of the ancient world took the terror of rising seas and turned it into lessons of morality, humility, and renewal. The flood became both a warning and a promise that chaos will come again, but life will endure. When archaeologists uncover the ruins of early civilizations along ancient shorelines, they find not only evidence of flood, but of remembrance. Temples built upon hills, altars dedicated to gods of rain and sea, carvings of boats and waves, and rituals tied to the return of seasonal floods all speak to a cultural memory older than writing. Even the architectural obsession with height, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the pyramids of Egypt, the mounds of the Mississippi Valley, may echo that ancient fear of drowning. Humanity learned to build upward because once, long ago, the waters rose. In this way, myth and geology meet. The stones confirm the stories, and the stories explain the stones. The flood myths are not lies told by the ignorant, but truths preserved by poets. They remind us that the line between legend and history is often a riverbank, one that shifts, erodes, and floods again. Every age since has carried its own version of the flood, whether literal or metaphorical. The Deluge has become a symbol of transformation, of endings and beginnings. It appears in religious texts, in dreams, in prophecies, in art. It is the subconscious of our species, an inheritance from ancestors who stood on a shore and watched the sea take everything they loved. The flood's greatest power lies in its timelessness. Even now, as the modern world faces rising seas from melting ice, we feel its echo. The same forces that drowned the old continents are stirring again, and once more we find ourselves asking the ancient question, how high will the waters rise, and what will endure when they fall? The myths do not give us answers, but they give us perspective. They remind us that humanity has faced the flood before and survived. The waters always rise, but so does memory. And perhaps that is the truest message of all, that the flood never ends, it only changes form, moving from sea to story, from world to mind, as eternal as the tide itself. In the dark heart of the younger Dryas, when ice gripped the earth and the sun hung weak above a frozen sky, something extraordinary happened. The evidence lies scattered across continents, in layers of soot, in the chemistry of ice, and in tiny diamonds no larger than a grain of dust. It tells of fire falling from the heavens. It tells of an encounter between Earth and something vast, cold and ancient, that came from the deep reaches of space. The Younger Dryas impact. Hypothesis, once dismissed as speculation, has grown into one of the most intriguing mysteries in modern science. Around 12,900 years ago, just as the planet was warming from its long ice age, the climate abruptly reversed. Temperatures plunged, megafauna vanished, and entire human cultures disappeared. For decades, the cause remained unknown. Then researchers began to notice a strange layer of sediment at the exact boundary between the warm and cold epochs. This thin black mat, as it came to be called, appeared across North America, Europe, and the Middle East. Within it lay clues that pointed not to volcanoes or glaciers, but to something extraterrestrial. Microscopic analysis revealed particles of melt glass, nanodiamonds, and high concentrations of platinum and iridium, metals rarely found in Earth's crust, but common in cosmic bodies. Such materials form only under immense heat and pressure, the kind created by the impact or atmospheric explosion of a large meteor or comet. Beneath these layers lay bones of mammoths and mastodons, remnants of forests turned to ash, and the tools of the vanished Clovis people. Above them lay a world transformed. For a long time, skeptics argued that the evidence could be explained by terrestrial events, wildfires, volcanic eruptions, or lightning strikes. But year by year, new discoveries began to strengthen the cosmic case. In Greenland's ice cores, scientists found a sharp spike in platinum concentration precisely at the Younger Dryas boundary. In South America, the same black layer appeared, containing identical impact markers. Across 4 continents, the same story was written in the soil. Something immense and fiery had passed through Earth's atmosphere at the end of the Ice Age. In 2018, researchers announced a discovery that reignited the debate: a massive circular depression buried beneath the Hiawatha Glacier in northwest Greenland. Measuring over 30 kilometers across, it lay hidden under nearly a kilometer of ice. Radar imaging revealed a structure that matched the profile of a recent impact crater. Analysis of sediments suggested it was younger than 50,000 years, and possibly as young as 12,000. If confirmed, it would mark the very scar of the Younger Dryas impact. To understand the scale of such an event, imagine a comet fragment several kilometers wide, entering the atmosphere at tens of kilometers per second. The air around it would ignite in a blinding plasma, and, before the object even struck the ground, the pressure wave would flatten everything for hundreds of kilometers. If it exploded in the air, as many scientists believe it did, the result would be similar to the Tunguska event of 1908, but magnified 1,000 times over. Forests across continents would burn. Shock waves would circle the globe. Dust and soot would rise into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight and plunging the Earth into a sudden winter. This chain of events could explain the mystery of the Younger Dryas, a millennium of cold that arrived almost overnight. The impact would have vaporized parts of the ice sheets, sending torrents of meltwater into the oceans. The sudden influx of fresh water would have disrupted oceanic circulation, cutting off the flow of warm currents to the north. Without that heat, the climate collapsed. Glaciers stabilized, sea levels paused, and the planet froze once again. It was a global domino effect, set in motion by a visitor from the void. The impact did more than change the weather, it changed life itself. The extinction of the Ice Age megafauna coincides almost exactly with the event. Mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and giant sloths vanished. The Clovis culture of North America, famous for its fluted spear points, disappeared from the archaeological record. In their place arose new cultures with different tools and hunting methods. To the survivors, it must have seemed as though the sky itself had turned against them. Around the world, ancient traditions record a time when fire fell from heaven before the flood. In the Middle East, some versions of the Deluge myth speak of a burning wind that preceded the waters. In North America, indigenous oral histories describe a day when the sky burned and the great animals died. The Hopi tell of the fourth world ending in fire and flood. The Norse myths of Ragnarok speak of fire raining from the heavens before the world is swallowed by the sea. Even in the Pacific, Polynesian stories describe a blazing star that fell into the ocean, bringing waves that washed away the land. What modern science calls an impact, ancient peoples remembered as divine retribution. To them, the heavens and the earth were alive, and when the sky erupted in flame, it could only mean the gods had spoken. The terror of that night, of seeing stars fall, the ground shake, and the air turn to fire, would have burned itself into human memory. When the survivors told their children of the world before the flood, they spoke of fire first, then water. The cosmic and the earthly were one catastrophe. In laboratories today, researchers continue to study the traces of that moment. Nanodiamonds, found in abundance at the boundary layer, are formed when carbon is compressed under intense pressure, such as that of a meteor strike. Tiny metallic spherules, droplets of vaporized rock that cooled as they fell, show evidence of rapid heating to temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees Celsius. In some sites, glass-like materials called tektites reveal the same conditions. None of these can be explained by simple forest fires or volcanic eruptions. They are the fingerprints of impact. Some scientists suggest that the younger Dryas event may have involved not one object but a swarm, a fragmented comet, similar to the modern-day Taurid complex, which Earth still passes through every year. The Taurids are known to contain large remnants, including kilometre-scale bodies. If one such fragment struck the northern ice sheets, others may have exploded in the atmosphere across multiple continents. The result would have been a global catastrophe: firestorms in North America, melting ice in Greenland, and shock waves circling the planet. Even today, evidence of these ancient fires remains. Layers of charcoal found in lake beds and peat bogs show that wildfires consumed entire regions at the onset of the younger Dryas. Atmospheric models suggest that the soot and dust would have reduced sunlight enough to cool the planet for centuries. The irony is profound. The fires that began with the comet ended by freezing the world. When the cold finally broke more than 1,000 years later, the ice that had survived began to melt with ferocity. The floods that followed reshaped continents, erased coastlines, and gave rise to the stories that became the world's flood myths. In this way, the comet did not simply end an age, it began another. The younger Dryas impact may also explain the curious timing of humanity's first great monuments. Göbekli Tepe, built at the precise end of that epoch, appears to commemorate both destruction and survival. Some researchers have interpreted the carvings on its pillars, vultures, scorpions, and celestial symbols, as records of a cosmic disaster, a message to future generations written in stone. If so, it would mean the first temple on Earth was a memorial to the comet that ended the Ice Age. To modern eyes, such ideas may seem mythic, but the line between myth and history is thin. The cosmos is indifferent to human chronology. It does not know our epochs or our ages. It acts according to its own rhythm, and when a fragment of that rhythm crosses our orbit, the consequences are written not just in rock but in story. The comet that ended an age reminds us that the Earth is not isolated. It moves through a celestial ocean filled with ice and stone, a place where catastrophe is part of creation. Every continent bears the scars of impacts past. Every generation inherits the memory of one too great to forget. Perhaps that is why the flood stories endure. They are not only about water, but about fire, about the knowledge that the sky can fall without warning. Humanity's first global myth may have begun with a real event, a night when the heavens themselves rained destruction, and the survivors awoke to a world washed clean. In the end, it was neither purely fire nor purely water that remade the Earth, but the dance between the two, the cosmic impact that froze the world, the thaw that followed, and the flood that changed everything. The comet did not end life. It transformed it, setting the stage for the dawn of civilization. The age of ice ended, and in its place rose the age of memory. When the waters finally stilled and the air grew warm again, a new world emerged from the wreckage. The last glaciers retreated to the poles, the seas reached their modern shores, and the Earth entered a long, gentle balance, the Holocene, the epoch of stability in which all human civilization would unfold. It was the calm after 12,000 years of chaos, the first true breath of spring after the deep winter of the Ice Age. Across the continents, survivors of the cataclysm adapted to a changed planet. The old landscapes of the Pleistocene were gone. The mammoth steppe, once stretching from Europe to Alaska, had vanished beneath forests and rising seas. In its place grew new ecosystems, rich in plants and animals suited to a warmer world. Humanity, now scattered but resilient, found itself in an environment both generous and demanding. The climate no longer swung between extremes. The seasons stabilized. For the first time, people could predict the future, and from that certainty, civilization was born. The end of the Ice Age had forced humanity to move. Coastal peoples retreated inland as the sea consumed their settlements. Nomadic hunters followed shrinking herds into mountain valleys and fertile river plains. These migrations scattered knowledge as much as they spread people. Wherever survivors settled, they brought with them fragments of the old world, myths of fire and flood, skills of survival, and the memory of what had been lost. It was in these fertile refuges carved by the very floods that had destroyed their ancestors that agriculture first took root. Along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in the cradle of Mesopotamia, wild grains flourished in the silt-rich soil left by retreating waters. There, people learned to plant, harvest, and store food. In Egypt, the Nile's annual floods became a rhythm of life, depositing layers of black mud that made the valley the breadbasket of the ancient world. In the Indus Basin, the monsoon rains fed rivers that carried fertility across the plains. In China, the Yellow River's lowest soil supported rice and millet. Everywhere the waters had risen, they now sustained life. The flood, once a destroyer, became a giver. Each year the rivers rose and fell, echoing the great deluge that had shaped the continents. People no longer fled the floods, they embraced them. They built levees, canals, and irrigation systems. They learned to predict the seasons by watching the stars. From this understanding came calendars, astronomy, and the first organized religions. The cycles of water and sky became sacred, and the gods who ruled them were worshipped as creators and destroyers. In the ruins of what had been chaos, order emerged. Settlements grew into villages, villages into cities. Clay tablets replaced oral memory. The flood that once erased knowledge now inspired its preservation. The first stories ever written, those of Sumer and Akkad, were records of both survival and gratitude. The gods had drowned the world once, and humankind would never forget. Göbekli Tepe, standing sentinel on its Turkish hilltop, was not the end of prehistory but the beginning of history. The people who built it, hunters and gatherers who became builders and priests, lit the spark of complex society. Their descendants spread the idea of monumentality, of sacred architecture, across the world. Within a few thousand years, ziggurats rose in Mesopotamia, pyramids in Egypt, and temples in India. The instinct to build upward, to reach toward the heavens and away from the floods, became universal. The same transformation unfolded across continents. In China, the first dynasties arose along rivers tamed by canals. In the Americas, civilizations took shape beside lakes and floodplains. In Africa, the savannas gave way to the organized societies of the Nile and Niger valleys. Everywhere, the pattern was the same. Where the flood had passed, life returned stronger. The human mind evolved too. The trauma of the cataclysm became part of our collective psyche. The memory of destruction turned into a yearning for permanence, for meaning in the face of uncertainty. The myths of the flood were not only history, they were therapy. They taught that catastrophe could cleanse, that survival was sacred, and that the world could begin again. Science now sees what the ancients only intuited. The Holocene was not inevitable. It was an interlude, a gift of cosmic and climatic balance. The Earth had swung wildly for millions of years between ice and warmth, yet for the last 12 millennia, temperatures have remained within a narrow band. This stability made agriculture, cities, and art possible. Without it, humanity might still be wandering the frozen plains. But stability is never eternal. The same forces that melted the ice and raised the seas remain at work today. The planet continues to respond to cycles of orbit, solar energy, and atmosphere. What was once a natural rhythm has now been altered by human hands. We have become, in a sense, the flood makers. In the first days after the Deluge, people looked to the mountains as symbols of hope. Mount Ararat, Mount Parnassus, Mount Meru, all sacred peaks rising above the waters, became metaphors for survival. The ark, the boat, the raft, these were symbols of human will, the means to navigate chaos. In every culture, the mountain and the vessel endure as icons of endurance, reminders that when the world ends, it begins again at the summit or upon the water. Archaeological traces of this rebirth lie beneath our feet. The earliest fields, marked by irrigation channels and terraces, date to the exact period following the final melt. The earliest villages appear on elevated ground, often beside rivers whose floods were predictable but dangerous. The earliest gods were gods of storm and sea, wielding floods as tools of judgment and renewal. Even writing, which began as a system for recording harvests and water levels, can be traced back to the need to control and remember the flood. Humanity did not simply recover from catastrophe, it was forged by it. The flood's destruction compressed evolution, forcing innovation in both technology and thought. To survive in a changing world, our ancestors learned foresight, cooperation, and creativity. The flood did not erase intelligence, it demanded it. The civilizations that followed were born from that crucible. In this way, the flood is both an end and a genesis myth. It marks the closing of the Ice Age and the birth of the human age. Before it, we were creatures of instinct and migration. After it, we became planners, builders, and dreamers. The flood gave us memory, and memory gave us time. As the Holocene unfolded, the earth settled into its present rhythm. Forests matured, rivers found steady courses. Humanity spread across every continent, filling the void left by the glaciers. But beneath the calm surface, the ancient pulse of the flood remained, buried in the collective mind. The ocean still whispers it in every wave that touches the shore. The rebirth of civilization was not the triumph of humankind over nature, it was an alliance. The same waters that once destroyed became partners in life. Every seed planted in a river valley, every field irrigated by floodwater was a silent acknowledgement of that history. The people of the New World lived with the flood rather than against it. They learned its rhythm, honored its power, and built their future on its ebb and flow. From that moment onward, human progress became inseparable from the control of water. Dams, canals, reservoirs, and ports followed in the footsteps of the first irrigation ditches. Each was an echo of the same instinct, to manage what once seemed divine. The flood that had been the great destroyer became the foundation of empire, and in doing so, it turned humanity into the architects of their own destiny. But even in their triumph, the memory of the flood lingered, carved into stone and scripture. It was the story of origin, the caution of hubris, the reminder that everything built on earth is temporary. Every civilization that has risen since carries within it the seed of that story. The flood that once swept away the ancient world still lives in us, as fear, as reverence, and as knowledge that the world can always begin again. The story of the flood is the story of Earth itself. It is not only the tale of a vanished epoch, but the rhythm of the planet's heart. Every rise and fall of sea, every surge of river, every melting of ice is a verse in that ancient song. Around 12,000 years ago, the last great flood reshaped continents, erased coastlines, and forged the foundations of civilization. It was the end of one world and the birth of another. Yet even now, that story is not finished. The flood never truly ended. It only changed form. When the Ice Age closed and the Holocene began, humanity stepped into an age of apparent stability. The climate warmed, the seas leveled, and for 10,000 years the Earth remained in rare balance. It was this balance that allowed humans to plant crops, to build cities, to measure time by the turning of the seasons. For a brief geological heartbeat, the planet offered peace. But peace, like land, is temporary. The forces that once drowned the Mammoth Plains and swallowed the coast of Doggerland have never gone away. They are only waiting. The ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, the glaciers that crown the world's mountains, are all relics of the same system that ended the Pleistocene. They are memories in frozen form, reminders of a time when water ruled everything. Each year, as temperatures rise, those memories awaken. The ice melts a little faster, the seas creep a little higher, and the ancient rhythm begins to beat again. We live within the same cycle that once ended an age, only now we are the ones accelerating it. Modern instruments tell a story that ancient myths once told through fear. Satellites measure the retreat of glaciers, the thinning of ice shelves, the swelling of the oceans. The numbers, though precise, echo what the ancients already knew, that water is both creator and destroyer. Since the beginning of the industrial era, the global sea level has risen more than 20 centimeters, and the rate continues to accelerate. If the great ice sheets collapse entirely, the oceans could rise by many meters, drowning cities as surely as the seas once drowned the coasts of the Ice Age. The parallels are haunting. The people who watched the seas rise 12,000 years ago stood helpless before the power of nature. We, in contrast, are the architects of our own flood. Through our machines and our hunger for energy, we have altered the balance that made civilization possible. The flood is coming again, not from a comet or a cosmic winter, but from the invisible accumulation of our own heat. And yet, even in this, there is a strange symmetry. The floods of the past erased ignorance. They forced adaptation. They forged intelligence through necessity. Perhaps the next flood will do the same. Humanity has always evolved at the edge of disaster. The civilizations that thrived after the Great Melt were those that learned to live with water, to read its moods, and to turn its danger into life. If history is a teacher, it whispers that survival depends not on denial, but on understanding. The evidence of that long-ago deluge lies everywhere, if one knows where to look. Beneath the North Sea, sonar maps trace riverbeds that once carried herds and hunters. Off India's coast, drowned cities sleep beneath the silt. In the ice of Greenland, dark bands mark the soot of ancient fires. Even the moon bears silent witness, its surface pitted by impacts from the same cosmic debris that once struck Earth. Every crater, every fossilized shell, every layer of marine clay on mountain peaks tells a single story repeated endlessly through time. Water always returns. The Great Flood that ended the Pleistocene was not a singular moment, but part of an eternal cycle of transformation. Ice becomes water, water becomes cloud, cloud becomes rain, and rain becomes ice again. The world breathes through this cycle. What we call catastrophe is simply the Earth exhaling. The flood is not vengeance, but metabolism, the planet's way of balancing energy and life. Our ancestors gave this process divine names. They spoke of gods who sent the waters, of rainmakers and sea kings, of serpents coiled beneath the waves. They understood that the flood was larger than comprehension, and so they clothed it in myth. Today, we replace the gods with equations and call it climate, but the awe remains. To watch a glacier calve, to see an entire ice wall collapse into the sea, is to witness a power that humbles every human design. The myths were not wrong to revere the flood. They were warnings wrapped in reverence. Noah's covenant, Deucalion's stones, Manu's boat, and Yu's channels all speak of the same truth. Survival is not given, it is earned. The flood is not punishment, but test. It asks each civilization what it has learned since the last time the waters rose. We too live within that question. The technologies that define our age, our satellites, our dams, our digital networks, depend on the same stability that the Holocene gave us. If that stability falters, so will the systems built upon it. The flood myths were never about the past alone. They were premonitions of cycles yet to come. The flood is also metaphor. It represents change, memory, and the relentless erasure of certainty. Every generation faces its own kind of deluge: war, disease, discovery, revelation. The waters take different forms, but the lesson endures. To resist the flood is to be broken by it. To understand it is to survive. Science, at its core, is the modern version of that understanding. By studying ice cores, sediments, and isotopes, we have learned to read the heartbeat of the planet. The strata of Earth are a library older than language. Each layer records the rise and fall of oceans, the pulse of glaciers, the breath of carbon in the air. When we study them, we are reading the same story our ancestors told by firelight, only with different symbols. Their myths were metaphors, our data are measurements, but both point to the same truth. The flood is the shape of change. If we look far ahead into the deep future, the pattern continues. In another 10,000 years, the orbit of Earth will tilt slightly, the balance of sunlight will shift, and ice will begin to gather again. The cycle will reverse, the seas will fall, the continents will expand, the flood will sleep, not die. Humanity's traces, if still standing, will become fossils in the next layer of stone. To the beings who come after us, if any remain, our ruins will tell the same story. The rise and fall of water, the rise and fall of civilization. And yet, there is comfort in this continuity. The flood reminds us that nothing truly ends. It transforms, renews, and begins again. The oceans that once swallowed the coasts of ancient people now cradle the life they left behind. The same molecules of water that drowned their world now flow through ours, through rivers, clouds, and blood. Every raindrop is a memory of the flood. Every wave that touches the shore is a whisper of that ancient night when the ice broke and the world was remade. Perhaps that is why the story of the flood endures in every culture. It speaks not only of fear, but of continuity. It tells us that the world is fragile yet eternal, that destruction and creation are one act. The flood is the reminder that we belong to a living planet, one that remembers its own past through us. The flood that ended an age was not sent by gods. It was written in the ice, in the stars, and in the heartbeat of a changing planet. The oceans rose once before, and someday they will rise again.